Okay. Sorry that took so long. Okay. Well, this is on a lecture on the social impact of the American Revolution, the impact the revolution had on the women, slaves, loyalists, and Native Americans. We're going to start with African Americans. The slaves at the time figured that all men are created equal because the patriots had said so in the Declaration of Independence. And that egalitarian sentiment entered into all social relations. Most slaves read the commitment toward equality as something that the nation stood for. But so blacks served as soldiers in the Continental Army to a great extent. They made up as many as 1/3 of the soldiers at the end of the war years as, because they recognized that they had a stake in this army that was trying to create equality. So that was part of what was going on. The northern states moved to emancipation in the course of the war, in court decisions, in legislation that was passed in northern states, and in the most common method of compensated or gradual emancipation. A state like New York passed a law that said if you were born after January 1st, 1800, that you were freed by this act at the age of 28 if you're a man and 25 if you're a woman. Well, pretty soon that broke down, and it was the emancipation, the freedom was granted to all New York slaves in the period between 1800 and 1824. New Jersey passed an act that gave emancipation when you reached a certain age after 1804, but New Jersey never passed an act to move that to immediate emancipation. They kept their act on the books until the Civil War, so that in the 1860 census, there are actually slaves in the free state of New Jersey because they never changed their laws to allow for freedom. If you were born before January 1st, 1804 in New Jersey, you were screwed. You were not freed by the act, and so you remained a slave. So in the southern states, blacks fought for the British side. The slaves in the South heard that the British were fighting for liberation for their side, and so they fought for the British side. They were offered freedom by the British, and roughly 25,000 slaves were granted freedom by the British at the end of the war. So the lower South during the war years moved to embrace slavery. They thought that the freedom of the Declaration of Independence only applied to white people. So slaves, seeing this duplicity among whites, moved to support the British as they fought. South Carolina went so far as to offer a bounty of a slave if you were to be a white person who joined the South Carolina Continental Army regiments. You were offered a bounty of a slave. So you had the irony of a human being offered to volunteers if you joined this army for freedom, which was pretty amazing. There's a movement toward manumission, freeing by your own hand your slaves in the upper South, so that many slaves were freed by their master by his decision to be non-slave owner, and manumission became very common in the upper South. This shows how prevalent manumission was in the upper South in the war years and right after. The first census in 1790 showed some free Black population, but by 1810, that number had grown tremendously. And so it shows that at least in the upper South, manumission was very common. And this shows the dates once again of abolition. In the northern states, you see there was immediate emancipation, and in the middle states, there was gradual emancipation. Regarding women and the idea of women joining the revolution, they were very important. Abigail Adams to her husband John, telling him to remember the ladies, had an impact on a slow impact, but women served as soldiers, spies, cooks, farmers, and patriots. They did the work of men while the war went on. So soldiers like Deborah Sampson fought, Molly Pitcher fought, Mercy Otis Warren wrote newspaper editorials and statements of trying to keep the morale up during the war. Women were regarded as important for their sons' education. The revolutionary motherhood idea was that the woman would educate her son in the ideas of republicanism and become a leading familial educator of the next generation. Loyalists were concentrated in some strongholds of Rhode Island and New York in the South. There were 20 to 40% of all Americans were loyalists, so that they were concentrated in the big cities, but they were all over the colonies of people who remained loyal to the King of England and the Parliament of England. Loyalists were victims of mob violence, as patriot Americans could identify loyalists as the problem, the reason why we're losing this war, so the thinking went, was because of loyalists who weakened the war effort by their actions, so that lackluster patriots could identify loyalists as the problem. Well, they were 20 to 40% of the population, and they lost their farms. But the colonists, the patriots, did not return their property to them at the end of the war. And finally, Native Americans are difficult to categorize. Some fought with the Patriots, but most fought with the British. It was perceived by Native Americans that most American colonists would take their land without asking. And so there was a lot of distrust between the Native Americans and the colonists in general. So most Native Americans fought on the British side, so that there was a terrible violent campaigns in the Northwest, in upstate New York, and upstate Pennsylvania that were very violent, and it enabled expansionist Americans to attack natives with relative impunity. When put into the war context, Native Americans lost out once again. So that's what happened to people like Joseph Brant and Red Cloud at the time, a corn planter at the time of the American Revolution. So the experience of these social groups tells us that the revolution years were incredibly divisive and a period of great change and a difficult transition from the colonial status to ruling yourselves. And these minority groups reflected the tensions of their era. Okay, that's it. We'll stop.